Hello and welcome to New Economic Thinking. I'm here this afternoon with Professor Anwar Shaikh of the New School for Social Research. We're here to discuss your book, Capitalism, Competition, Conflict, and Crises, which you've just completed. Anwar, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, this book challenges many of the traditional preconceptions that animate the economics profession. Why don't you describe some of the things that you were trying to achieve in the book?
When I started as a graduate student, I was surprised to discover that the representation of the world was in this idealized, fictitious form, which made no sense to me. And that as an economist, you have to accept that and begin from there and then try to show why the world doesn't fit that and then spend your time showing how the world was imperfect.
The common caricature is that in every other social science or even science, you have people who seek empirical data and they try to derive models on the basis of that empirical data.
That's right.
Whereas economics, at least it's, according to the popular caricature, tends to develop beautiful models. And if reality intrudes inconveniently, then the tendency is to exclude reality.
I think that's right, but I don't find the models beautiful. My father was in the foreign service of Pakistan, and we traveled to many different countries, different cultures, and I couldn't find anything recognizable in the description of this, nor could you find it really in Adam Smith or Ricardo or Marx or Keynes. So it led me to think about how could you start from scratch with a foundation that doesn't require this kind of starting point and therefore isn't always at odds with the world that you see.
And what sort of an economics comes out of developing I don't want to say a model, but a depiction of reality, if you like?
To start with, the first thing I wanted to work on was try to have a space for different visions of how people behave, real behavior, which involves very complicated sets of reactions.
Not simply the utility
Exactly.
maximizing agents that Adam Smith
Absolutely
described.
right, and they're not really in Adam Smith, and so that's one
No,
of
the
the
caricature
things.
of Adam
The
Smith.
caricature,
Yes.
it's the appropriation of Adam Smith into this fictitious, what I think of as a biblical world. And that doesn't make any sense to me. If you're going to be analyzing the biological world, you can either start with the creationist myth or you can start with Darwin. It seems to me pretty sensible that you have to do what Darwin did, which is to look at the world that you see and then derive the properties from there.
And what are the conclusions you derive from that?
First of all, I'm talking about capitalism. I can't claim to have any expertise about humanity in general. And it seems to me a central thing is that it's driven by profitability. In a double sense, no firm supplies something unless it expects profit, so that the supply is driven by the expectation of profitability. On the other hand, once it makes a decision to supply, it has to hire workers, which fuels a consumption demand for workers. It has to buy raw materials, which is a demand in the materials market. It has to investment, which is the investment demand. And then it pays out rents, profits, interest, and all of that from the profits. And that's the source of the demand for people who get income from property. So you can unify kind of a Piketty issue of where the demand comes from and where the supply comes from focusing on the role of profit.
And how does that contrast with, say, what we're taught in our Economics 101 textbooks?
Many different ways, and the book is big because I try to lay out the different ways. I took it as my task to try to explain everything that orthodox economics and post-Keynesian heterodox economics tries to explain in the broad sense from a different unified framework.
So let's take a few concrete examples.
Okay, so here's one. If you teach microeconomics, you're taught that you need to have utility maximizing and rational choice in order to derive demand curves and elasticities and so on. Yet I learned at the hands of my teacher, who was Gary Becker, by the way, who wrote a fabulous article in 1963 showing that, in fact, you don't need any of those assumptions to derive all those properties because they come from the fact that people's incomes are constrained. And so if you raise the price of something, people will tend to buy less of it. If you raise the income, they'll tend to buy more of whatever they want. And from this, applying some relatively simple algebraic tools, I'm able to show that I can derive all of the basic empirical propositions of consumer behavior without any need to make any of those assumptions. There's no need for that hypothesis of maximizing and optimizing at all.
Okay, give me another one.
The theory of the firm. If you look at how firms operate, you have to look at the fact that they are price setters. That's been obvious from the very start. Adam Smith talks about that.
Marx talks about that.
Marx talks about that. And since they're price setters, it cannot come as a surprise to discover that firms are price setters because orthodox theory says they shouldn't be. Firms take demand into account, as Keynes points out, but they must. The price they set has dependent on what they think they can capture in the market. There's no guarantee. Firms lose money. That's an obvious point, but there's a kind of biological point to it. Many die. Roughly 70% of firms die within the first 3 years. So if you approach it this way, then you have a way of looking at the principles of behavior of firms. They set prices, they try to survive, some win, some don't. They use tools to attack each other. That's a normal part of the biological process of competition.
So when you talk about the theory of the firm, you mentioned the antecedents, Smith, Ricardo, Marx. As you said, all of these ideas that you've discussed today are not new ideas. You were going back to historic antecedents. So what happened to economics to make it go away from these core principles, if you like?
I think the reason these are not new ideas is that they were developed from the observation of how firms actually behave. And they led to a particular theoretical foundation. But that foundation had built into the essence of it a conflictual structure. Competition is conflict. Competition involves some firms trying to beat other firms. The setting of wages is conflictual. It's in the interest of capitalists to have it as low as possible, and workers to have it high as possible. And that notion of essentially a conflictual structure became allied with political movements, or became associated with political movements in which conflict against capitalism, the idea of socialism, the idea that firms and capitalists are involved in a struggle, that became unpleasant to many people in the profession. And it gave room for the few crazy people who at that time were viewed as completely crazy. We're talking about ideal capitalism, Menger and Jevons and Walras. These are people who are trying to formulate a different vision of capitalism, and many of them quite explicitly say to move away from the political conflictual notion towards one of harmony and service to the consumer.
I've always thought in some respects of this idea that you can divorce economics from politics. I mean, it's as absurd as the idea that you can stop talking about numbers when you're dealing with mathematics.
I think that's right. And so that's economics is ultimately a social science, and therefore it's a historical and political science. And we have to understand, why does Keynes come back into fashion against this powerful orthodoxy? Because he sees the world doesn't fit, but his ideas only have purchase when the world itself becomes receptive, because there's a crisis in the 1930s, and suddenly he becomes a person to go to for understanding how the system operates. And then that breach is closed. And then by the 50s and 60s, you've gone back to this vision of everything perfect. And again, it opens in the 70s when there's a crisis in the world, the banking crises, and many others across the world, and then it closes again, and now it's opened again. So you cannot tell the history of the oscillation between the schools without knowing something about the politics and historical development.
Now, I'm intrigued, you mentioned you studied under Gary Becker. Ideologically, I would say it's fair to say he's in a slightly different camp than you.
I would say that's correct, yes.
But, and he is often associated with this new, or the non-political type of economics, and yet you imply something very different, that he actually was not, maybe we've unfairly misrepresented him over there.
Well, it's very interesting because he tortured us with all the details of the elasticities and optimizing. It was such a difficult course. It was the advanced micro course, it's the second year. And then in the middle of it, he came in and gave this amazing lecture in which he showed that he can derive everything without any of these assumptions. And I naturally immediately thought, I have to do something with this. It took me 30 years because to write the introduction of the book, which is about microeconomics, I had to first work out the whole rest of the story and come back to the foundation that permit all of that story. And Becker chose not to follow that up because he saw quickly that it would exile him from the profession. The profession would never accept the idea. Now we can say that he pioneered what might be called stochastic economics, economics of showing that individual behavior is very complicated, but in the aggregate it produces stable patterns.
But it is interesting when you mention that if you are inclined to pursue something that's a little bit less orthodox, you can quickly be consigned to the margins of
Indeed.
economic study.
Indeed, and it's happened many times in the history of economics. That's another thing that one learns if you study the history of economic thought, that as the tides shift, people whose ideas are perfectly valid get excluded. I mean, one of the founders of the New School where I teach is Veblen, and Veblen's ideas were enormous purchase at one point, and then they got sidelined.
In fact, his ideas of the firm are not too dissimilar from yours.
I think that's right, because again, he was interested in looking how firms behave. And my goal in the book is to show that I can derive these properties that you see empirically. How firms set prices, how they differ, how costs differ, why they differ, how they're driven to cut costs and compete with each other. And again, I find very useful sources of business literature. Harvard Business Review is a great place to find out how firms actually operate.
John Kenneth Galbraith spent a lot of time discussing this. Obviously, the corporations he used for his models or the discussions were very different from today. But it sounds to me that there's echoes of J.K. Galbraith in your work as well.
I'm a great admirer of his, and his son Jamie also was followed in that tradition. I think the one difference is that I've argued throughout the book that what drives us is competition, not monopoly. And that the association that the large scale of a firm implies monopoly power comes from the attachment to a neoclassical idea that a competitive firm has to be minuscule. And there's no reason for that whatsoever. And neither logical nor empirical. And what I try to show, for instance, in the book, is that profit rate equalization across industries takes place on new investment, then it's completely independent of the size of the firm. One could argue actually the bigger firms are better at it because they have no attachment, so to speak, to what they do.
Well, also the bigger firms, arguably, once they get to a certain size, they can eliminate that competition. So it's the move, perhaps, from competition to monopoly which governs the behavior.
I argue not, and that's one of the features of the book, is that, yes, of course they do, but the fact is that the they is a big firm involved in many different industries. So if you eliminate a weaker competitor in your industry, it doesn't prevent another big conglomerate from entering it. And they're all competing against each other. They sell foods and chemicals and whatever. And anything that makes money attracts money, attracts people who have big bucks to try to make funds from it. I mean, take the space program. There's supposedly only a few private firms in there, but there will be more, for sure, because there's money to be made in it. So I'm a great believer in capitalism in that sense, that it creates the means by which it can take advantage of profitability.
So it's not so much capitalism in a sense that it contains the seeds of its own destruction, as Marx says, but rent-seeking monopolization, which actually contains the seeds of its own destruction.
But it's rent-seeking, but it's not necessarily rent-getting.
Yeah.
Because the elimination of rent is part of the job of capitalists. That's arbitrage. If someone can get it, then other people can try.
That's the competitive element.
That's right. And this way the state can come in and protect pools of rent and all of that. We know that history, but you don't need the state to do that if there wasn't this fear and recognized possibility of others coming and taking it away from you.
Now, one of the other interesting features about the book is you talk about the neoclassicals on the one hand and the heterodox economists on the other. But you don't put yourself in, I mean, your thinking is somewhat heterodox, but you don't put yourself in the heterodox economist camp. Where do you think that they get it wrong?
Well, no, I'm in the heterodox camp, but the heterodox camp is dominated by the idea that the world you see is not this perfection model, so therefore it must be imperfection. And it seems to me that is rather like being a person who used to believe in a certain brand of religion and now doesn't believe in it because the religion doesn't match the world. I don't see the point of that. I've always argued from the very beginning that you need to have a foundation which doesn't see the world as an alien place, that is not sensible except for introducing departures and deviations. I think what you see in the world is perfectly sensible. It follows from the logic of profitability. It follows from the logic that firms are driven to operate under, and people also in the pressures that are brought on them. So I don't see this as a question of imperfection. In fact, I just want to say that I think the very notion of imperfection is the dual of perfection. You cannot speak about imperfection unless you are implicitly paying allegiance to perfection. And I don't want to be trapped within that space.
Okay, fair enough. But let me take it in a more philosophical direction. I mean, if you're moving your economic thought in a highly empirical direction, But even arch empiricists such as David Hume, for example, recognize that at a certain point, or Kant as well, they argued that there were certain organizing principles which couldn't be empirically established, that you had to have a priori concepts to structure that. Actually. So how does that fit in with your model? You must assume certain things.
I have to say that at least 50%, 60% of my book is theoretical. I do the empirical work because I want to show that the propositions you can derive from the basic theory can be observed at a certain level of concretion. And let me explain what I mean by that. My early training was in aerospace engineering. I was an engineer undergraduate. And one thing I learned is that if you have something like the law of gravity, it says that in a vacuum, if you drop a feather and a rock, they'll fall at the same rate. But of course, the next step in the analysis to understand if you pump a fluid into that same cylinder, they will not drop at the same rate. And that's not a violation of the law of gravity, it's a concretization. It shows you that when you introduce another element, something new will happen, but it does not negate the law of gravity. So applying it to firms. We know that firms are under pressure to cut prices from new competitors, and they're always trying to block new competitors, and therefore themselves are always trying to become new competitors somewhere else. Well, when a firm comes in and lowers its price, or gets a plant with a lower cost, it forces prices to drop. But the firms that have the highest cost are the least able to cut their prices because their costs are higher. So they meet some of it, hoping that their customers will not drift away right away. And so you get a staggered set of price increases. This is a well-known thing that Harvard Business Review emphasizes, for instance. Well, that staggered set of price increases is related to cost. So therefore, we expect a correlation between price and cost. That's the foundation of Kalecki's argument. But he derives it as monopoly. I'm arguing that this is a necessary consequence of the dynamics of competition. And it becomes persistent because there are new firms always coming in and old ones going out. And so when you look at the picture, you'll always see it, but it's not a departure from competition. It's the process itself.
And is your hope ultimately that this type of economics supplants what's taught to these poor misbegotten undergraduates that use the old traditional tools?
Yeah. I want to thank INET for having supported this book, first of all, and it's very important because I would not have been able to finish it. This was 15 years in the making, and the last year and a half was supported by INET grants. And my immediate interest is trying to make this into the foundation for an alternate curriculum, not one based on modifications of the existing framework. I understand that that would be much more plausible and much easier to sell. But from a scientific point of view, I don't want to be in that space. I want to have a way for people to start where culture and gender and race and individual path collisions of life have room at the fundamental micro level, and to show that from there I can derive many properties at the aggregate level all the way to macroeconomics, questions of crisis and austerity, from a coherent foundation without having to introduce deviations, so to speak.
Expanding the safe zone from which we can have a rational discussion about economics.
I would hope so, but I also know that if you try to do that, you're likely to get the most severe and visceral reaction. And we know this from the history of economic thought, people who've tried to do this before. Andrews at Oxford, for instance, who'd studied how the firms behave and then was essentially exiled, had to leave Oxford because it created so much difficulty for both the neoclassicals and the imperfectionists, both of whom opposed his presentation of the actual evidence.
Truth and fresh insights that challenge traditional or conventional wisdom is often a painful process.
Indeed. I can show you the scars, but I will not open my shirt at this moment.
It's very courageous of you to undertake that path, and we're happy to support you. Anwar Shaikh, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.